useful scheme. Especially, we have today grouped these amount of schemes because we are seeing that a number of members are gearing up towards reopening and towards getting businesses restarted. And these schemes might help them in their planning and also alleviate a bit the burden of certain investments, certain increases in headcount that they will need to make. So, Kane, I will leave it in your good hands. We will first hear the explanation from your end. Who has questions, you can use the chat or else the Q&A at the bottom of this page, and we will be answering them following the explanation of Kane.
Thank you, Abigail. Good morning, everyone, and good morning to my colleagues at the Malta Chamber of SMEs. Thanks for the invitation, and today we'll be focusing on three schemes, specifically the Investment Date 2021 scheme, the Business Development 2021 scheme, and the Skills Development 2020 scheme. Now, in my opinion, what I can do is I start by explaining scheme by scheme. If there are any questions once I complete the first round, which would be the Investment Day 2021, we can take some questions. Then we move on to the Business Development, a round of questions, and then again, same for the Skills Development scheme. So instead of providing a PowerPoint presentation, I just wanted to share my screen and go immediately on the scheme guidelines of the first scheme, which is the Investment Date 2021 scheme. So stop sharing. Just a second. So the Investment Date 2021 scheme. Now, this incentive is intended for a number of activities rather than economic sectors, but a number of activities where there is an initial investment project that is going to be undertaken by the applicant company. Now, what do we mean by an initial investment project? Now, an initial investment project, we have a number of categories. Usually, as per definition by the guidelines, by the incentive aid guidelines, it is either the setting up of a new establishment, which would constitute an initial investment project, an investment in order to improve the capacity of the company's output, whether it's a product or service output. So basically investing further in your CapEx, or rather in your headcount in order to increase your capacity, but also a diversification project. Diversifying into a new activity or a new service is also taken into consideration as an initial investment project. Now, first things first, because this is very important. What are the eligible activities under this particular scheme? So this scheme was available in reality before, but we did some changes last year in order to offer a more holistic incentive for a number of projects which previously were not catered for under the incentive. Now, although there are certain activities which are excluded, however, there are others which have been integrated. For example, if we go to the education sector, there were some limitations before under the previous investment date. Even healthcare, for example, those conditions which were a bit discriminatory in their respect have been eliminated, and now all projects under those sectors, for example, which constitute an initial investment project, can be considered under the investment aid scheme. Now, if we go for the audiovisual sector, now the audiovisual sector, for example, all aspects in the AV supply chain, for example, even going to the length of providing equipment, AV equipment, for example, is also considered as an eligible activity, always as defined by an initial investment project. Now, in order to provide a hypothetical scenario, because this is very important, because we need to understand whether I qualify or not for the scheme. So if I have a company who is undertaking a project whereby I am increasing my asset base in the company, for example, adding on my existing portfolio of equipment in order to provide a better service or an improved service, basically investing in CapEx, that is an eligible project under the investment day scheme. However, given that the incentive can be either granted on the capital expense itself or otherwise based on the amount of people engaged, so on the headcount increase in the company. For those employees who are intrinsically related to that CapEx being undertaken, the applicant company can choose whether to apply for assistance based on the capital expense incurred, or rather on the employment cost incurred, which is a result of that CapEx carried out. Now, you might ask me, usually, probably CapEx, if I have a project in mind, the initial cost would be larger for CapEx other than the resultant wage cost. And that might be the case. However, the scheme, and this is a very important point, that when it comes to employment, the investment date scheme takes into consideration those employees who were engaged in a 3-year period post the capital expense being carried out. Now, the 3-year period means that anyone engaged in the company who would be employed by the beneficiary at that stage, because the project would have been pre-approved by Malt Enterprise, would have been approved by Malt Enterprise. And those employees were engaged as part of the implementation of that project. Those employees, the costs associated with the wage costs of those employees are considered as an eligible cost item. So if I am a tech-based company, I might require a number of computers, for example, a number of desktop computers or laptops to carry out my business. So that would be the initial capital required. However, if I compare that cost to the employee's cost who is going to use that equipment, probably it might make more sense to apply for investment date on wage cost rather than CapEx. I'm saying this in order to explain how flexible the scheme is and how it can be applied to different scenarios. This is a tax-based incentive rather than, in principle, rather than a cash grant-based incentive. However, for those projects where the project is going to commence hasn't still started, and I will explain exactly how it works, and you require a cash injection element through cash reimbursement, not a cash upfront, because this is a very important point, Malt Enterprise can consider through an evaluation process whether that project is going to be supported in part through a cash grant rather than fully as a tax credit. Now, how does this work? What do I mean when I say a project which has yet to commence prior to a project which is already in process? So the investment date scheme at this point in time takes into consideration projects, eligible projects, as defined before, which have commenced from the 1st of January 2020 until projects which are going to commence by the end of December 2023. So we have a 4-year period, projects throughout a 4-year period, where at this point in time, we are carrying out the evaluation process. Now, for projects which have already started, which have already commenced, we can still approve assistance, but assistance in that case would be granted in terms of a tax credit, not a cash grant, even if the applicant requires and requests assistance in terms of a cash grant rather than a tax credit. But for projects which have already commenced, due to what we call the incentive effect, where basically if you were in a position to carry out the project through maybe different sources of financing, have already started the project, we can still approve it subject to an evaluation, subject to an eligibility criteria, but support would be granted in terms of a tax credit. However, if there are projects which are yet to commence, so when the start of works hasn't elapsed, you can still provide an application and apply, if required, for a cash grant rather than a tax credit. And the evaluation process ensues. We see both the financial position of the applicant company, but also the economic return of the project per se. Subject to that, we decide whether the project would be approved partially or in full, usually partially, as a cash grant rather than fully as a tax credit. Now, I mentioned a 4-year period. Now, the scheme guidelines, the scheme per se, the investment date as we know it today, the investment aid 2021, has a deadline by the end of this year. So this means that all projects needs to be approved by Malta Enterprise. So 2020, 2021, 22 and 23 projects have to be approved by Malta Enterprise by the end of this year, which means that ideally any applications submitted have to be submitted by at least end of October this year. So Malta Enterprise has enough time to carry out its evaluation process. But if you are considering an investment project, an initial investment project as defined by the guidelines, it is important to approach us, we discuss your case, and any application is to be submitted ideally by end of October. So Malta Enterprise has enough time to issue its approval letters in time by the end of the year. Again, projects can commence next year or the following year. The scheme also covers those projects. Now, when it comes to intensity rates, to the percentage of support that Malta Enterprise can consider under investment aid, we have mostly 3 categories. Then we have something which is a bit separate to the hospitality industry. So for small enterprises, for small enterprises in general, what we mean are those undertakings which employ up to 50 employees at the point of application, not throughout the implementation of the project, but at the point of application. Assistance is at 30% of the eligible project cost. For medium-sized enterprises, so anyone who employs between 51 to 250 employees, it's at 20% of the project cost. For large enterprises, it is at 10% of the project cost. Now, when it comes to large enterprises, we can consider support under investment aid, but it has to be a diversification project. So the company, the large undertaking, in order to avail itself of the investment aid for a project that is going to be carried out, needs to enter into a new industry, needs to diversify operations into a new industry in order for it to be considered under investment aid. For SMEs, this clause doesn't apply. So if you are establishing a new operation, that is eligible in principle. If I am investing to increase my production output, my capacity, that is also in principle an eligible cost, an eligible project, depending on the number of activities that we saw in the guidelines. Manufacturing, IT, AV, hospitality, so healthcare, a lot of eligible activities can be considered under investment aid. Support is uncapped, so there is no capping under investment aid scheme. So a project cost can run into millions in theory, and support can run into millions in theory. Also, and this is a very important point, which is a bit different than the microinvest scheme, which Abigail rightly so mentioned before, any tax credits granted under investment aid can be carried forward indefinitely until they are fully absorbed. So whilst the microinvest, each certificate has a lifetime usually of a 3-year period, this investment aid scheme, as before as well, but this is something which is also applicable in the current scheme. Each tax credit certificate can be carried forward indefinitely until fully absorbed. So if I have a year where I'm making a loss, not a profit, and I'm not paying any tax for that particular year, I'm not losing any time in absorbing and utilizing my tax credit certificate. So that can be carried forward. But even if I have a profitable year and I have a number of accumulated losses where I'm not paying tax in the forthcoming years, that is okay when it comes to the investment aid certificate, because the certificate is carried forward indefinitely until I fully utilize it. Now, investment aid is a very particular scheme, and I'm saying a very particular scheme is that if you are eligible for investment aid, the process at Malta Enterprise end, if you require a tax credit rather than a cash grant, is the same process as we have for the micro invest scheme. Now, I'm comparing like with like because the process flow at our end is the same when it comes to tax credits under investment aid. You are eligible, you are in line with the guidelines, you are requesting a tax credit certificate. What we carry out is a documentary process. At Malta Enterprise, we see that everything is in order, but there is no what we call an evaluation process, whether we are considering to support through a cash grant or through a tax credit. If you are eligible and the project is eligible, you will get assistance through investment aid as a tax credit. But if you request in the application form assistance through a cash grant, then the process is a bit different. There is an evaluation process where it's not just whether you are eligible for aid under investment aid, but we see also what the economic impact of the project is, the financial position and the financial prospects of the applicant, and we see also how this investment basically is going to help you in your business plan going forward. Subject to that, we then move towards a decision on the case. So when it comes to a cash grant, investment aid, it's a very one-to-one basis. So each case is different from the other. Financial requirements vary, but investment aid, I think, when it comes to capital investments, so capital costs associated with plant, machinery, extension of factories or operating spaces, I think it is a good scheme to consider. Again, although my presentation will not feature ERDF funding, which are also still available today by the Measures and Support Division, I think, and I do suggest this, that when opting for which scheme you should go for, whether it's Malta Enterprise schemes, whether it's EU-funded measures, I think you should be as well informed as you should on all schemes available. Because, for example, there is an ERDF funded measure, which is the SME growth, where calls are still open, and I'm sure there are presentations through the Malta Chamber of SMEs on these schemes. And for small enterprises at 30%, all right, assistance is capped at €500,000, if I understand correctly. But if granted, it's fully granted as a cash grant. Whilst investment aid, it's a very good scheme, it's uncapped. But if you require cash grants, usually support is granted 50% tax, 50% cash grant. Usually, it can be flexible, but usually that's the case. I don't think I have anything to add at this point on the Investment Aid 2021 scheme, so I can take questions from your end now.
Thank you for that, Kane. Very, very interesting. And I have many questions, so I'm going to start. I'm going to take the opportunity. First of all, someone asked for the link. Now we will be sending you the link from where you can acquire the guidance notes. Kane, some questions from my end, because I could relate to a number of cases that members have are going through, and maybe they might be interested to apply for this. In terms of the current uncertainty of the economic situation, since there is a deadline and they should start preparing now, and they are unsure whether they would be able to go through with a project. Is it possible that they start talking to you, they put in their investment idea that they hope will materialize next year or the following, and then should something happen, they can get in touch again with Malta Enterprise and maybe reschedule or else postpone for the time being?
Yes, that is actually very possible, Abigail. In fact, we are also encouraging anyone who requests information on the scheme that if you intend to carry out a project in the future, you should apply under the investment aid scheme. I think it would be better to have an approval letter by Malta Enterprise, and maybe the project differs or maybe changes in the future, or wouldn't even materialize, for all I know. But at least it would be covered by an approval letter. The only difference that it would make, and this is something which is a bit technical, but might become relevant, is that if you have an approval under investment aid and you opt for financing in the future on the same project through other schemes, maybe not Malta Enterprise incentives, that approval letter might hinder your chances of getting support through other schemes. But then it's a case of deciding whether to drop investment aid or continue with investment aid.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Another question, a bit COVID related. We have seen some businesses scale back a little bit because of COVID. So they might have had to let go of their presence in a number of areas. And now they might be looking at potentially re-expanding, even in relation to staff. They might have had to let go of some staff because of the COVID impact. Is there a point where the scheme takes a snapshot of the capital investment that the business has, or the number of staff that the business has, in order to assess whether there was actually an increase, or as long as there is an increase happening, it doesn't make a difference?
No. In reality, under the investment aid scheme, we move with investment aid scheme despite COVID, which means that if the project being presented to Malta Enterprise is eligible going forward, so through the activity being carried out, because basically that is the two defining factors under investment aid, whether the activity is captured under the scheme guidelines, and also whether the project falls in the definition of the initial investment project. Whether the company has suffered losses because of COVID or not, that is secondary when it comes to the investment aid scheme. Okay. So if your project going forward is eligible, then we can consider that project under investment aid scheme. Okay. In reality, and I just wanted to add this, as an injection of funds to finance certain operating costs because of COVID, this wouldn't be the natural scheme to opt for. But when it comes to an investment project, then yes, investment aid, I believe, is one of the very good options available.
Okay. Another question. When it comes to certain investments which are required as a minimum by law, as far as I know, microinvest, if you require, I don't know, to make a specific refurbishment to upgrade your equipment because it's a minimum required by law, you cannot apply for a tax credit by microinvest because it was a minimum requirement, but I'm not sure about that. I don't know if it is the case under the investment aid because obviously the capital investment will still be carried out. Does it make a difference if it is a minimum requirement by law or no?
No, the investment aid scheme doesn't specify a minimum investment cost. Now, given that you mentioned the microinvest scheme, then yes, it would apply in the sense that if I have a minimum investment, an investment, whereby when calculating the aid intensity, it would make more sense to apply for microinvest, and you are eligible for the microinvest scheme. It would be us at Malt Enterprise who ideally guide you. Listen, you have submitted an application for investment aid. I don't know. I'm shooting from the hip, a 10,000 euro investment, for example. Given that the aid intensity of investment aid is 30% for small, and microinvest at minimum gives you 45%, it would make more sense to apply for microinvest unless you have the upcoming 3 years where you're not going to pay tax. Then yes, we fully understand that you should apply for investment aid because tax credits would be carried forward indefinitely.
Okay. You mentioned that there is no maximum capping. Is there a minimum under the scheme?
No, I think I just mentioned this in this reply.
Okay. There's no minimum project value.
No, there's
There
no
might be a
minimum
scheme that is
project
more
value.
adequate than the other. Okay.
Exactly.
Kane, what kind of documentation would be required for the investment aid?
So for the investment aid, there are two scenarios: whether I'm applying for a tax credit or else I am applying for a cash grant. Now, when it comes to the tax credits, we only require the support request, which is the application per se. And that is enough. And there's also the enterprise size declaration, which is another very important document to define and determine the company size, the undertaking and difficulty test, which is applicable for all schemes, not just Malt Enterprise, but also any state aid supported measures, where basically, in principle, it is that if I am an undertaking in difficulty, and there are two categories, if I'm an SME or a large company. SME, basically, we see the number of accumulated losses in the previous 2 years, we're basically meaning that you are financing your operations to an increased debt to equity ratio. And when it comes to large enterprises, we also take into consideration most of the gearing ratio, so the debt to equity ratio and how I am financing operations. This has become very important because of last year and this year. And in fact, we are taking into consideration previous years, not just 2020, because 2020 was an extraordinary year, as obviously everyone knows. So when it comes to tax credits, it would be those three forms. So the application form, the enterprise size declaration, and the undertaking and difficulty test. For cash grants, then we require additional documentation, such as, for example, financial forecasts and a project brief, which would be a bit different. In any case, and I think this would help your cause, any additional material that you can provide as a potential applicant company, which will help in your argument for a cash grant, you can provide that. And we at Malta Enterprise, we take that into consideration when we are evaluating a proposal for an upcoming project.
Okay, so that's all from my end. I'm going to start with the Q&A scheme first, instead not starting from the chat. So Charmaine is asking, reinvestment aid, if the company is in service industry and is looking to invest in new property as office to replace current due to current space limitations, is that eligible for a scheme through tax credit?
Yes, in principle it is. And I want to explain why I say in principle, because we had cases and usually we also learn from previous cases. So the office block per se, so the building, the property, is an eligible cost item. However, we have cases, and it is very, very normal, that if you are investing in a property whereby you're not utilizing the full footprint or the full available spaces for the eligible operation, the eligible activity as defined by investment aid, we have to calculate and apportion that part which is being used for the eligible activity. If in full it is going to be used for the eligible activity, we take into consideration the cost of the building. If not, if it's just one floor or a few offices, for example, we have to take into consideration that part of the building. I mean, it can be, the scheme is very flexible, but it has to support that capital expense, whether it's immovable or non-immovable assets, which have to be related to the eligible activity as defined by the scheme.
Okay. We have another question. If a licensed further and higher education institution would invest in an online platform to deliver courses online, would the institution be eligible for the investment aid scheme, please?
Yes, but the platform has to be part of that, have to be capitalized. They have to be part of the balance sheet. So it's not license fees, for example, but it has to be an asset that then becomes part of the company's, of the beneficiary company's assets.
Okay. Another question from John. Does the hospitality industry include restaurants?
No, the hospitality industry under the scheme doesn't include restaurant. In fact, when it comes to the hospitality, we can support the operation of hotels and guest houses and their amenities as licensed by the Malta Tourism Authority. There was a scheme which was available, I think it was 2 years ago, where restaurants were also eligible. In fact, it was a specific schemes for the for the hospitality industry, which also included restaurants. At this point in time, that scheme is not available, but there are discussions ongoing on how we can extend further support to those operations. But that is something which has still to be, discussed internally and decided upon. So no, in truth, the investment aid scheme doesn't cover restaurants as a separate activity.
Yes, one can maybe look at microinvest in that case.
One can look at possibly the microinvest scheme, exactly.
Yes. Patrick is asking, are OPEX costs eligible? Example, cloud servers, cloud software.
No. So if there are certain intangible assets, such as, for example, an intangible asset, which is capitalized, which becomes part of my asset register, then yes, that is considered as eligible under the investment aid scheme. However, if it is associated with operating costs such as licenses, so that becomes a recurring expense, then no, that cannot be taken into consideration. However, if that is the case, if license fees, for example, is the projected cost of your project, and you are operating in an activity which is aligned with the investment aid scheme, and you need additional staff to operate, it might be the case that we consider the eligible staff costs as the cost associated with that project. But that merits a separate discussion on its own.
Related to this, Kane, someone is asking, Joe is asking, is software development included?
Software development, meaning in-house or subcontracted? Because if subcontracted, yes, in-house it would be captured by the operating expenses associated with wage costs under investment aid scheme. Now, shortly I will be moving to another scheme which captures certain cost items and is a bit more flexible when it comes to how we can support in terms of eligible cost items, which is the Business Development 2021 scheme. Something which I failed to mention, the investment aid scheme falls under the General Block Exemption Regulation, not the de minimis regulation. As you might know, de minimis is a regulation whereby support granted under various incentives that fall under de minimis cannot, there's a capping of 200,000 over a rolling 3-year period. So for example, if I have gained a tax credit certificate under Microinvest, which is one of the de minimis measures, I might say one of the most accessed de minimis incentives of 50,000, then for the upcoming 2-year period, I have a balance of 150,000 available under the de minimis regulation. Investment aid is not de minimis.
That's a very good point. So if the amount allocated is exhausted under de minimis, one can look into investment aid.
Yes, yes.
Another question from the Q&A from Rennie. A construction company, are we eligible for any plant machinery purchasing, such as thermic machines, cranes, etc.?
So the construction industry, there was a scheme available up until a few months ago when it was for the replacement of plant and machinery,
Yes.
which has closed a few months back. So the construction industry, the construction activity per se, is not covered under the scheme. However, if the company has a separate activity where it manufactures construction material, then that can be taken into consideration as a manufacturing activity, because manufacturing is then eligible under the investment aid scheme.
Another question from the Q&A. Is investment in electric vehicles / charging stations, in brackets private transport sector, eligible, please?
That is a very good question, in fact. Now, there are certain limitations to what we can consider as eligible vehicle associated costs under investment aid. Now, in reality, because you also mentioned charging points. Now, charging points per se, if it's part of the infrastructure associated with an eligible project as defined by the scheme, and it would be captured in one or more of the activities considered under investment aid, that can be looked at favorably. However, if the charging point would be as part of an infrastructure cost, which is not captured under the investment aid scheme, then that is not eligible. However, as a fallback, and sometimes or many times, the microinvest would be used as a fallback. If you then are eligible for microinvest, but it is a de minimis measure, you can avail yourself of the microinvest scheme. If I may, and not to take many more questions related to investment aid. If we can take maybe the last two questions, and then we move on to the second scheme.
Yes.
Any
In fact, I think
queries?
we have a final one.
Okay.
In general, if they would like to start discussions about these schemes and they would like to bounce off a number of ideas, where should they start from? Should they contact Business First and start from there, or else should they contact Multi Enterprise directly?
Business First is the point of single contact. And if I say otherwise, probably Abigail will mention this in the upcoming Business First board meeting. So, no, Business First is the first point of contact when it comes to incentives. However, given that you are discussing these schemes with me, feel free to drop me an email and we'll discuss them. We'll discuss each case on its own merit.
Okay, so we will pass on Kane's email address to you on the chat
Yes, thank you.
for those who are interested. So shall we go to the business development now?
Yes. So another very interesting scheme, Business Development 2021. Now, there are certain similarities between investment aid and business development in terms of the nature of cost items or the scope of the scheme per se. But one very, very, very important point under business development is that this is a de minimis measure. So any support granted under business development that is taken into consideration as a de minimis aid. So, and this is a side note, but I think it's a very, very important side note, that business development shouldn't be abused of, meaning that if I am eligible for other incentives for this particular project that I am undertaking under other measures which are not de minimis, my first option should be non-de minimis aid. Because it might be the case that in the future I would require an injection of sorts of funding, and de minimis would be the only option. And if I have fully utilized de minimis aid, then I would have no fallback whatsoever. And de minimis aid, it is very easy for government entities to get de minimis aid approved by Brussels, not so much other incentives. But that is a side note, saying that business development is a very good scheme, and sometimes it has to be looked at and possibly tapped. So, business development, as I said, it is a de minimis scheme. It is very flexible in its composition, meaning that there are no set aid intensity rates. There is no such thing as a universal aid intensity rate like what we have for investment aid. However, and this is something which I believe is also important for us at Multi Enterprise, we try to move with the principle of co-financing projects. So usually assistance under this scheme wouldn't exceed 50% of the eligible project cost. So although there is no official capping under the incentive, but the capping for projects because of the de minimis regulation is that 25% of the project has to be free from aid, but that comes from the de minimis regulation, not through the scheme per se. We try not to exceed the 50% mark. But this is something that is flexible, but usually is the case when it comes to our evaluation process. So if we go on the eligibility clauses, There are a number of activities as well which are eligible under the Business Development Scheme, and these would be, by and large, these activities mentioned here. So manufacturing, management of waste and environmental solutions, R&D activities, industrial services analogous to the manufacturing industry, digitization of processes, and then there is a very important footnote here, and we'll go in detail in it. Development of digital services, including video games and entertainment systems intended for international markets. The aviation and industry and maintenance and repairs of machinery, artisanal works, and this also very important eligibility clause, services that by nature are not limited to a geographic scope and are scalable international. Let me start with the last one, in fact, because it also gives a perspective of what we want to achieve through the Business Development 2021 scheme. Now, the incentive is intended to help industry grow. Now, that is a very generic term to use, and maybe it is used as a cliche. But if you have a project, and I might be using the term project loosely here, but if you have a cost which is intended to help you grow your operations, maybe diversify into a new market, which is a new vertical, would be a new sector, maybe reaching an international audience, creating employment opportunities, creating new products or services. If this is the case, if that is your case, then possibly you might be eligible for support under Business Development 2021. I would also link that, before going specifically on the eligible activities as sectors, if I have the intention to digitize my processes, my internal processes, then that is also considered as an eligible expense under the Business Development 2021 scheme. So I go back to our friend before who asked a question related to the restaurant industry, for example. So if I have a restaurant and I'm using the restaurant as a potential case study for other activities which are not captured as a sector under the scheme. But if I have a restaurant and the restaurant is going to undertake certain investment and carry out certain expenses which are associated with digitizing their internal processes, I don't know, for example, an enterprise resource planning system, possibly also certain digital processes which help in the logistics part of the service per se, and other processes, other IT processes, which will enable the company basically to become more profitable and more resilient to external shocks. And I'm trying to associate it as much as possible with COVID. But it is the intention to grow, to scale up operations, not to operate in a fully saturated market, but creating something new. If this is the case, it might be opportune to discuss your project in terms of support under Business Development 2021, because it is not outright excluded. What we try to do is that we understand that digital processes and because of the digital innovation ongoing, and it has become sort of a horizontal approach at Malt Enterprise when it comes to digitization projects. We are becoming quite flexible in our schemes, and business development, in fact, is one of the schemes which specifically mention digitization as an eligible project. So the scheme is like the investment aid, can be granted as a tax credit or a cash grant or a mix of both. It depends on the client's request, obviously, and all the other criteria that I mentioned before in the investment aid scheme. They also apply for business development. And it is available for both startups and non-startups, something which is also the case in the investment aid scheme. The application is the application template that we have at Malt Enterprise. Now, ideally, applications are always submitted electronically, and we have certain manual guides that can help you submit your application. But the business, going back to the business development scheme, it's quite flexible as an incentive, but it supports certain specific cost items. And we can go and have a look at what can be supported under the scheme per se. It's quite varied in its approach. So if I have a project which requires that I relocate personnel from abroad, because I'm establishing maybe, for example, a new establishment locally in line with the scheme guidelines, the relocation cost or part of the relocation cost associated with these key personnel, maybe they are not employed at this point in time, but they are intended to be employed by the company going forward in order to implement the project and become gainfully occupied by the company. That part of the cost in traveling, that is considered as eligible. Even if there are certain, and I'm going to be here, if there are certain shipping costs associated of personal items by the employees, the shipping cost can also be considered as eligible under the measure. Going also into the detail that if there are rental costs, personal rental costs for the relocation period of the personnel, up to a 3-month period, that can also be considered as eligible. Now, we have to understand Malt Enterprise position as an investment promotion agency. So from our end, we both try and support the local industry in terms of the local pool of existing operators, but also it is also in our remit to attract further investment from abroad, whether it's investment promotion, inward investment promotion, or supporting existing industry. This clause applies to both. Payroll cost, so wage cost. Wage cost is also an eligible cost item, whereby the in order as a safeguard, we have included a clause that at least employees have to be covered by minimum 24-month contract, so 2 years. And before claiming for any assistance approved when it comes to wage cost, that person needs to have been engaged by the company for a minimum period of 6 months. So post-approval date, say for example, May 2021, you have your project approved by Malt Enterprise, covering payroll costs. You engage someone with you in May, then 6 months after you can start claiming on that cost approved. Lease and rental of real estate. So if I'm renting an operating space to carry out my project, subject that that space has the necessary licenses required to operate and to carry out your business as defined in the business plan. So for example, if I am a food manufacturer and by law I require that I have a food safety license, that it requires to have, for example, a HACCP license. If I'm exporting to certain, I don't know, markets, I need a BRC license. If you are set according to law or standards or required standards, the lease, the cost of the rent per se, is also considered as an eligible cost item under the business development scheme. Support and advisory services. So any consultancy or advisory services associated with both defining and implementing the project, so conceptualizing and implementing the project, and project closure, to take into consideration the different stages of project management, that can also be considered as eligible cost items. Rights, licenses, certifications, such as different ISOs, for example, or different licenses as mentioned before, such as HACCP, BRC, for example, environmental management solutions. These would be licenses. These would be covered also under this particular scheme. Relocation of tangible assets and procurement of tangible assets. So any capex involved in the project can also, and its relocation cost associated, can be considered as eligible under the Business Development 2021 scheme. Nothing to add at this stage from my end. I think we can proceed to questions.
Thank you, Kane. There is a question on the chat on the business development. What items would be considered eligible for digitalization of internal processes, third-party software costs, licensing of the product, maintenance agreements, training costs, etc.?
So very good questions. I clicked on a wrong button, but then I noticed. So that's a very good question. Training costs aside, because I think we have two schemes which are which link to training, which is the skills development scheme by Malta Enterprise and later by Jobs Plus skills, the investing in skills scheme. So when it comes to licenses, and this is a very good point, and thanks for asking that question because I was going to miss that. When it comes to licenses under the business development scheme, it is the one-time cost. So it is the initial license required. When it becomes a recurring fee, then Malta Enterprise cannot support the recurring expense. But if I need to purchase a software or a license as the initial cost, we can consider that as eligible under the business development scheme and also under the microinvest, which is a bit separate. When it comes to the digitalization process, what can be considered as eligible under the scheme? What if there are certain consultancy, subcontracted consultancy schemes, certain consultancy services associated with that process, that is considered as eligible. So if I engage a consultant to draft a project, to draft a project that needs to be implemented, that consultancy cost can also be, and that is the project in itself, that is considered as eligible under the measure, under the business development scheme.
Okay, same question as the one we had before in terms of software development.
All right.
Would it be an eligible cost, software development in general, probably outsourced?
So outsourced, yes. In fact, I want to go back to support and advisory services. So if I am subcontracting a particular service, a particular part of the project, and it requires subcontracting, that service per se is considered as eligible. Now, it is the initial project cost which we take into consideration. If there are maintenance agreements with the consultant, with the subcontract, not just contracted, it can be a subcontracted, a service provider, an IT software, as a software developer. The maintenance part of the agreement cannot be supported under the business development scheme. But the initial cost associated with providing the software per se, that is taken into consideration as an eligible cost item under the Business Development 2021 scheme.
Okay. Now, going to the Q&As, Charmaine is asking, if we are a security service company looking to upgrade our website, is this eligible or consultancy regarding quality ISO 19001?
So, in principle, yes, as a project. So we have to take into consideration that multi-enterprise schemes in general, apart from the micro-invest scheme, do not take into consideration one-off expenses. So if I want to build a website, for example, if I want to engage someone to provide me with a website, that alone wouldn't qualify as eligible for support under business development. That would qualify under micro-invest. But if the website is an expense associated with a more holistic project to help you expand your operations, to help you engage further customers, to help you diversify your operations, to help you increase your product portfolio or your services portfolio, that website building, together with other cost items, can be considered as eligible. Now we have to define the project period then in that case. So in that case, hypothetically, we see what the project period is. What are the costs associated in the different phases of the project period? If the project is rendered as eligible under this particular scheme, then we see what cost items we can consider in order for you to claim and absorb any funding approved by multi-enterprise. Again, this is a very flexible scheme, and it is flexible in nature in order to identify and support those activities which are in their nature trying to do something which is new or improved than what there already exists in the market. If that is the case, then business development might be applicable also in your case.
Okay, another question from the Q&A. If I wanted to expand my business to the US and I wanted to go and attend a fair, would this be part of business development?
No, that is not a cost item which is considered under business development. Our sister company, Trade Malta, has its own incentives when it comes to outward investment. A few months back, but this was integrated also with the Trade Malta incentives package, we had a scheme where you can attend business development meetings, client meetings, which was called Cooperate for Growth. It was a multi-enterprise incentive. But this was creating certain administrative issues, and also people wouldn't know whether to access Trade Malta or multi-enterprise for these costs. So anything related with attending business abroad, so to speak, that is captured, apart from training, because this is something that we can touch upon. I suggest that you get in touch with Trade Malta. If you need a contact by Trade Malta, at Trade Malta, kindly ask Abigail or me then separately.
Yes. They do have, in fact, a scheme which is very much in line with what is being asked. Yeah. Ramon is asking, you mentioned that under the business development scheme, there are skills related to food safety and HACCP. What are the courses that would be eligible for this area, food and food safety?
So, for example, if we take a certificate, because HACCP at the end of the day is a certificate. So the audit costs and I think are you still seeing the screen?
Yeah.
So the audit costs associated with obtaining that certificate, the audit cost is eligible, the audit cost per se, but also the certificate cost itself. So both the costs associated with obtaining the certificate, so the certificate cost, because there is a cost associated with the certificate itself, and any audit costs associated which lead to the certification, that is considered as eligible. Now I mentioned HACCP to give just a scenario, just an example. But even, for example, ISO 9001, Total Quality Management, for example, that is also considered as an eligible cost under the business development. Again, and this is very important because we are also going to see certain changes in the microinvest scheme going forward, that if the certificate cost is the only cost that you are going to incur, so it is not part of a more holistic project to expand your operations or to diversify and whatnot, that in the future can be covered under microinvest. But if the certificate costs and the audit costs associated are part of a more holistic project and you are eligible for the business development scheme, that can be considered under this particular measure.
Okay, so I think we have our last 2-3 questions. 2 I am going to group together. Is this applicable to projects that have started but are not complete yet? And on the same lines, a software development company has been investing in developing a software program for the past 3 years using an external developer. It expects to conclude the program in the coming months. Would this investment be eligible?
The scheme only supports costs that haven't been incurred yet. So any costs approved and supported have to be post-approval date. So we don't go backdated when it comes to cost items that are to be incurred. Now, the question is different, however. Can we consider projects which have already started? Yes, but probably support in that case would be granted as tax credit. And I explain a bit why. If the company, through a lot of effort, managed to raise the necessary financing to start the project, Malt Enterprise, in theory, wouldn't be in a position to back its decision if it grants a cash grant for that project, because the project has commenced, meaning that the company has managed to raise financing to finance the project. So in that case, in theory, we can support through a tax credit rather than a cash grant. But again, there is an evaluation process, and the evaluation process, there are a lot of clarifications during that process, which might lead to a different outcome then.
Okay. Last 2 quickly, because I know you're very pressed for time, King. Do employees located abroad qualify under the scheme?
Sorry, I didn't ask the question.
Do employees located abroad qualify under the scheme?
That is an excellent question. A very good question. Now, so as a basic requirement, Malt Enterprise can look at employees which are engaged with the company and are paying taxes in Malta. but are also paying social security contributions in Malta. Now, the world has changed dramatically, especially in the last 2 years. So if I have an employee, Anzi, I'm trying to seek talent, and I managed to find talent abroad, but this person doesn't make sense financially or for any reasons, doesn't want to move to Malta. Can that cost, and he is engaged with the company, he is gainfully occupied with the company, he's registered with Jobs Plus and whatnot. There, at this point in time, that person needs to have a material association in Malta, with Malta. So the activity has to be carried out from Malta. So technically speaking, that cost item per se wouldn't qualify. But given that the scheme is very flexible in its approach, we can take into consideration what the costs associated are. And maybe help in financing through other eligible cost items, which you might not have expected Malta Enterprise to support you in. So instead, and this is a case where we have to discuss on a one-to-one basis, where if the project is eligible and the project is very important to support, maybe economically speaking, we can cover other cost items which are available under the scheme instead of you absorbing any funds approved through the payroll cost, given that there is a bit of a barrier for certain cost items.
Okay. Lastly, fairs organized in Malta in a specific sector such as maritime, does it qualify under business development?
Fairs, meaning that you a fair locally. I didn't.
I am not sure. Fair is organized in Malta, so the person would not be organizing the fair himself or herself, but they would participate in the fair. I am assuming. Any cost related to fair participation locally?
If it's participating in fairs,
actually, they are organizing a fair themselves.
It's not something that is. It's not something that is covered under the scheme. Organizing fairs and participating in fairs usually were associated with another scheme, but participating in fairs abroad, not held in Malta. In terms of organizing fairs, we can look at the case, but it's not something that in general is supported under the measure per se.
Okay. So with that, we have reached the end of the question. So we can quickly move to skills development, which is an important scheme for businesses which are a bit running low on resources, but would like to train their employees and also get a bit of help more related to their human resources. It's a very important scheme in this case.
So thank you, Abigail. So the last scheme that I'm going to mention is the skills development scheme. And I also know that, that Jobs Plus have a very interesting measure that is also intended to provide financial support for any training and upskilling program that you might need to carry out. So the skills development scheme, again, it's not a de minimis scheme, so it's not covered, it's not kept at 200,000. In fact, support can run into millions. The intention is to help sustain industry with a more quality workforce. That is, in a nutshell, the mission statement, so to speak, of the skills development scheme. So training and upskilling, which is not mandated by law, but you are undertaking or offering these opportunities for your employees, in order to have a more skilled workforce, that is the scope of the incentive, to help you sustain financially that cost associated with training and upskilling. What is considered as an eligible training? So first of all, because I was going to miss this, because this is something which is very also important from our end at Malt Enterprise. So all activities, so all industries are eligible for this scheme. And I'm mentioning this because, for example, the agriculture, forestry and fishing industry, whilst they are largely uncovered by Malt Enterprise schemes, to put it mildly, when it comes to training, upskilling, but also R&D, it's not something that I'm going to mention today, the sectors are eligible to get support by Malt Enterprise. So the scheme covers a number of training programs. So if I am carrying out in-house training is considered as an eligible training program under the scheme. And I will go into details of what is supported and what is not supported. If I look at getting an external trainer to carry out a training program or an upskilling program for my employees, that is also considered as an eligible training program. The drafting of the training program itself, or the material of the training that is going to be carried out, that cost item is also associated as an eligible cost item. When traveling ensues and employees need to attend a training session as defined in the project approved by Malt Enterprise, those cost items are largely considered as eligible. So any training which will help the company, and I'm saying company interchangeably with other forms of legal entities, self-employed, cooperatives, it doesn't, partnerships, what doesn't make a difference. If this training is intended to upskill my workforce in order to provide my employees with additional skills to undertake new projects or new products or work more efficiently, so to speak, that training is eligible. Now, applicants have to employ at minimum 5 employees. So anyone who is not employing up to 5 employees cannot be supported under the skills development. So that is something that has to be considered. Intensity rates, aid intensity rates under the scheme are very attractive under the skills development scheme. It is one of the very few schemes where aid intensities, as per scheme guidelines, are more than 50%, are more than the 50% threshold, as for example, I mentioned in the business development scheme. So for small enterprises, so those companies which employ up to 50 employees, for small companies, the aid intensity of the project cost is at 70%. When it comes to medium-sized companies, it's at 60%, and 50 and large companies, it's at 50%, the aid intensity. And if we look at, for example, cost items per se, there are a number of cost items which are considered as eligible. Sorry, I stopped sharing for whatever reason. So there are a number of eligible cost items under the scheme. So before I mentioned the drafting of the training program. So the drafting of the training program, the consultancy services associated with that, is eligible under the scheme. I have some pets here. Sorry, because you are listening to a number of birds nesting near my office. Wage cost of trainees, so the direct contact hours, as a gross salary, we take into consideration the gross salary, so any NI contributions by the employer, that is also considered as an eligible cost item. Cost of trainers, before I also mentioned before that if I am engaging an external trainer, that cost is in the contact hours during the training, during the course of the training program, that is also eligible as cost items. And when traveling ensues, we have here air travel expenses incurred because of engaging employees in training programs abroad. And also if I'm getting a trainer from abroad, the air travel associated with the trainer is also eligible as a cost item. Also, if I'm renting any training rooms or other facilities and equipment to carry out this training program, that is also considered as an eligible cost item. Now, since last year, the beginning of last year, whilst in principle support under the scheme is granted as tax credits, Malta Enterprise has largely provided support under the measure as a cash grant rather than a tax credit. Support can also be granted as a mix of both tax credits and cash grants. In that case, as I said before, we take into considerations a number of factors. However, since last year, usually if a training program is eligible for support under the skills development, support would be granted in terms of a cash grant rather than a tax credit. If we see but an applicant company has enough cash to finance its operations, to carry out a training program, is profitable year on year, it might be the case, but then it's subject to an evaluation process as before, but it might be the case that support is granted in terms of a tax credit. But we understand that cash flow is a problem at this point in time, so probably the first option would be to grant support in terms of a cash grant rather than a tax credit. Nothing to add from my end. I think we can proceed with questions.
Anyone interested in applying, is there a particular contact point that can help out with filling in the application or guiding a bit businesses wanting to apply for this particular scheme?
That is a very good question, and these type of questions have in fact increased when Malta Enterprise shifted towards online applications rather than paper-based applications. Now we have included an online manual, a guide to fill in the applications, and sometimes this requires a more technical input. At this point in time, the first point of call, as mentioned before, would be business first. However, if matters are raised, we check internally with the IT department, and then we get back with possibly a good way forward on how to submit an online application. If that doesn't become the case, if that is still difficult, we can look at the possibility of submitting a paper-based application.
Okay. Now, next question. Reskills development and the minimum requirement for 5 employees. Do these need to be all full-time employees?
So let me check. Yes, on full-time basis. They must be employed on a full-time basis.
Okay.
These 5 employees.
Okay. Giacomo is asking, no, first let's go to the other one. Okay. So, a bit of unrelated questions particularly to the scheme. Someone is asking to compare, but now when the presentation is carried out by Jobs Plus, we will be able to compare exactly the difference between the schemes. Business Development Scheme for rights, licenses, and certifications. What is the percentage amount awarded in tax credits or grants?
That depends on the nature of the project being assessed. Now, business development, as mentioned, can be granted as a tax credit or a cash grant or a mix of both. It depends. It depends on the case. If we see, for example, that the applicant company needs a financial injection, needs a boost at the beginning because of cash flow reasons, we might proceed with providing a percentage as a cash grant, and then the remaining of support would be granted as tax credits. I mean, I saw cases where we had 50-50 cash, we had 60-40, we even had a case of 90% tax credits and 10% cash grant, for example. So it really depends. It really depends on the case itself, especially throughout the implementation project and the claim period stipulated by the approval letter then.
Okay. Final question. In the case of microinvest, can the company be eligible for a cash grant instead of a tax credit?
There was, because of COVID, however, and also Abigail, I think, can mention something also because we mentioned microinvest. Last year, we gave the opportunity for those beneficiaries that already had a microinvest certificate in hand to request a change of a few thousand euros. I forgot exactly. I think it was 2,000 or 3,000 euros. That certificate, part of that certificate would change into a cash grant. We're looking at the possibility of further extending that possibility in the upcoming microinvest scheme.
Okay, so thanks a lot for your time, Kane. We need to improve our time management skills because we did not manage as we had agreed in 1 hour, and we are a bit overrunning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions, please feel free as always.
Yes, thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions that come to mind following this, pass them on to us and we will relate them to Kane. Thank you very much, Kane. Now we can move on to the Jobs Plus presentations, and in this way you can also compare how the scheme that Kane just explained compares with the initiatives and measures that Jobs Plus has to offer. Hello, Christian Hollier from Jobs Plus, and I will leave it in your hands to go through the scheme. Okay. We have both an employment and a training scheme that Jobs Plus will be talking to us about.
First, we'll be talking about the employment date scheme, which practically is the access to employment scheme. Most probably many of you are aware of the scheme, but we'll be providing you a brief overview who is eligible and who is not, the subsidy rates, and even how one can apply for such scheme. So practically the access to employment scheme provides employment aid to enterprises both in Malta and even in Gozo to promote the recruitment of the most challenging among job seekers, unemployment and inactive person. We'll be explaining who exactly these participants are in the coming slides. So as you might be aware, the Access to Employment Scheme, Jobs Plus launched this scheme way back in 2015 when we launched the first call. We had an available budget of 12 million at that time, and the rates were 85 euros or 1 to 5 euros per week, depending on under which target group the participants fall. In 1st January 2020, we launched the second call, and we had a remaining available budget of 4.5 million. At that time, in the second call, we raised the subsidy rate from 85 euros to 104 euros and from 1 to 5 euros to 155 euros. Last October, we launched the third call. The third call included some amendments in the target groups, which we are explaining exactly what amendments were, what target groups were included in the Access to Employment scheme. Last January, it was launched the 3.1 call, which we further increased the rates to 104.50 per week and 156.50 per week. And we had a still available budget of 1.7 million at 1st January. And we had paid also 7 million to beneficiaries. At the end of April, we issued another, we checked our financials, and we still have available budgets of 500,000 for the Access to Employment scheme. So therefore, who is interested to apply for when they are recruiting new employees, it's important to submit their application. And they also have paid a total amount of 7.7 million to beneficiaries. As you can see, the rates have increased from the first call to the last call. And as I explained, we also yearly are including from call 2 for our grant agreements issued on the second call. We are increasing also the cost of living allowance in every year. So who are the eligible employers? Practically eligible employers having all employers who have an economic activity, irrespective of their legal form, are eligible for the scheme. It includes NGOs, social partners, self-employed persons, associations, and business companies, partnership. So any type of business located in Malta or Gozo and have an economic activity is eligible for this scheme. Also, NGOs and social partners who does not have an economic activity are eligible to benefit for this scheme. So one may say, which NGOs are eligible for this scheme? All NGOs who are registered under the Commission for Voluntary Organization are eligible for this scheme, while social partners who are listed with the DIER, Department of Industrial and Employment Relations, are eligible to benefit from the Access to Employment scheme. Now we will be seeing which participants are eligible for the scheme, meaning from which target groups the employers can employ and benefit for such scheme. So practically there are 8 different target groups, but in summary we can explain these in these 6 points. So any unemployed person who is previously unemployed for the previous 6, 12, or 24 months. Therefore, when an employer is recruiting a new person who has been unemployed for the previous 6, 12, or 24 months is eligible for the scheme. When we say unemployed, it does not mean that he has to be registered for unemployed with JobsPlus. The important thing, the end date of his last employment here in Malta. Also, the youths between 15 to 24 who completed one of another JobsPlus scheme, that is Youth Guarantee, Work Exposure, or Traineeship scheme, are eligible for this scheme. Therefore, if an employee first try an employee on the Work Exposure scheme, then he can employ such youth on the Access to Employment scheme. Also, single adults looking after dependents are eligible. Low-skilled employees are eligible for this scheme, and upper secondary who has not attained an upper secondary education, which is up to the secondary education to Form 5, and a person who is the age of 50 years of age and over, and also a registered disabled person, those disabled persons who are registered with JobsPlus. I will be explaining further because this was one of the updates which was included lately in the Access to Employment scheme. So any person who is registered with JobsPlus who is unemployed or is in part-time employment is eligible for this scheme. So a person with disability who is in part-time employment can then be transferred to full-time employment. with the same employer or with a different employer, and the employer, the current employer can be subsidized for the part-time employment, because the from part-time he's shifted to full-time, so he will be subsidized the difference. If it's with a different employer, the new employer will be benefiting for all the full amount. Also, if there is an employee who has been working with a company for a couple of years, even months, and something occurs to him, and now he is registered as a disabled person, from the third call, the employer, although the participant, the employee, is not a new employee, but has lately registered as disabled, he can benefit for that, can benefit for a subsidy for that person who has lately registered as disabled. So practically, most of the participant status are eligible for this scheme. The only statuses that are ineligible for this scheme are those who have an asylum seekers, third country national, and any UK national who has entered Malta after 2020, since these are considered as third country nationals. Therefore, Maltese EU citizens, UK nationals who entered Malta before 2020, freedom of movement by marriage, tenth country, family, EU dependent, subsidiary protection, refugee, and temporary humanitarian protection are all eligible for the access to employment scheme. So the duration of assistance for when an employer will be eligible for the access to employment scheme, depending on which target group the employer will be found eligible, will vary the duration and of assistance and the retention period. For disadvantaged person, there is a duration of assistance of 52 weeks, and the employer needs to keep in employment for months in retention the participants. In relation to severely disadvantaged person, it is a 104 weeks and an 8 months retention, while for persons with disability, it is a 156 weeks duration of assistance with a retention of 12 months period. In relation to disabled persons, since this scheme needs to be ended by 2023, now the grant agreements being signed are for a less period, because from now till 2023 there are not 156 weeks. Therefore, we are decreasing the grants with the amount of weeks that there is still available. Also, the retention period is being calculated accordingly. When an employer needs to submit an A2E application, the employer has two possibilities when he can submit an A2E application. He can submit the A2E application prior engagement the new employee, or else he can employ the employee, but within 1 month from the date of engagement, the employer needs to submit the A2E application. Therefore, the difference between the date of engagement that he has submitted to Jobs Plus till the acknowledgement date, there needs to be only a 1 month period. Therefore, the employer can first employ the person. After 2 weeks, he can submit an A2E application. I will be explaining you how one can apply for this scheme. It's really simple. One can go over to our website, www.jobsplus.gov.mt/A2E, which will directly direct you to the A2E webpage. Then one can click on Apply Now, find the latest A2E application form, which is at the top page of fill it out, fill in all the details of the application electronically, and download the form. The form needs to be signed both by the employer and the employee, and then such form can be submitted by email to a2e.jobsplus@gov.mt. At this, we are not requesting any hard copy forms. Therefore, all forms are being accepted electronically through our email address. Now, the employer may ask, when will will be getting back our subsidy back, when we can claim back the funds. Therefore, the employer has a possibility to claim after every 13 weeks or 26 weeks. When the period of payment is lapsed and the 13 weeks has lapsed, Jobs Plus will contact the employer, will guide him how to fill in the claim for reimbursement and what needs to be done. Practically, it's one table, the number of weeks, and the rate and the amount the employer will be claiming. Such form needs to be signed both by the employer and then the employee. And once again, such form needs to be sent to our email address, a2e.jobsplus.gov.mt. Also, the employer, if the participant has terminated prematurely, the employer can claim for that period of time the employee has been working with the employer, meaning if the grant is of 52 weeks and the participant, the employee left or the employer terminates the employee's employment during the probation period, like we say after 3 months, the employer can claim for those 3 months. So as I explained, Jobs Plus has adopted a new procedure how we are receiving claims. This is due to the current situation also. So any documents at application, grant stage, and even at reimbursement stage, employers need to send everything by email. There is no need to send any copies, hard copies. Even the signing of the grant agreement, this is being done everything electronically. Therefore, and no one needs to come to Jobs Plus to sign the grant agreement or to send any copies by post. So practically, that is a brief summary about the Access to Employment scheme. These are my contact details and even the contact details of the A2E unit, where there's a generic email and even a generic phone. There are always someone who can answer your queries, who can guide you if you have any difficulties. And even if you need to apply, can guide you in the application process, how it should be filled in and everything.
Thank you very much, Christian, for that explanation. And we have 2 questions. First one is, can you benefit from the A2E scheme if you are also eligible for the COVID wage supplement for the employee?
Yes. So practically, we are conducting our checks with Malta Enterprise. So the only thing that cannot be done is that the employer can get up to the 100%, meaning that if the employer is paying the employee, let's say 100 euros per week, and he's getting 50 euros from the COVID wage supplement, he can only get 50 euros from the Access to Employment scheme, but not more. Therefore, the employer can benefit both from the A2E and from the COVID wage supplement. We are doing our checks and our workings to confirm these.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question from Mark. I have 2 youths who just started under the work exposure scheme. When can I apply for the A2E scheme, especially since it seems to be coming to an end?
Yes, he can submit even though they are currently on the work exposure scheme and the intention of the employer is to keep these participants in employment in the future. He can submit an A2E application now. And then such application obviously will not be processed till the end of the work exposure scheme, but it will be processed afterwards once the work exposure will finish. So ideally, my recommendation is to submit an application now for these participants.
Thank you very much for that, Christian. We don't have any more questions. So now we can move on to the last presentation by Martin on the training scheme that is offered by Jobs Plus, and attendees can also compare a bit between different schemes.
Hello, good afternoon. We're going to speak to you about a training aid scheme, investing in skills, that's administered by Jobs Plus. The scheme is funded by the EU, and therefore it's part of that. It's part of EU. It's an totally EU funded scheme. Next, Cree. Thank you. The scheme is basically all about supporting employers to train their workforce. The company has to be located in Malta, and I will now give you a bit of information about the scheme. Obviously, the training being in the past, most of our applications used to form part of what we call classroom training, or kind of training where there's physical contact with the trainees. COVID created a challenge not only for ongoing training, but also we had to see how we are going to adapt the scheme to continue giving employers opportunities for training their staff. So we operate on a system of flat rates, which means, unlike in previous training aid schemes that Jobs Plus used to administer, we used to ask for the invoice, proof of payment, and even quotations, 3 quotations, depending on the course of training. We have come up with these simplification measures where we do not ask for any paperwork related to financials and pay on flat rates. So the training cost subsidy that we can offer on the training element is 25 euro 85 cents per trainee per hour. This means that if you send 10 trainees, the rate per hour will go up to 258.50. So it is per trainee per hour. To complement this, during the time that people are getting trained, we also offer a wage subsidy cost of 5.20 per trainee per hour. In the case of investing in skills, however, if the employer is receiving COVID-19 benefits, we cannot offer this subsidy. We have adapted the scheme to as well include wage cost subsidies that are for not only classroom style training as was before, but also that type of training that is e-learning with live sessions. We also can offer a subsidy on air travel rates should you wish to bring a trainer to deliver training locally, or else if you have members of staff that need to go abroad to get specialist training. So we covered the subsidy for air travel too. Again, we have a co-financing rate where large enterprises can receive up to 50% of the 100% of the valid cost components. Medium will receive 60%, and small and micro will receive 70%. We also have on board, we also accept applications from NGOs and social partners that do not conduct an economic activity, as well as those that do. However, the classification and the size, the aid intensity will be calculated solely on their headcount. So who is eligible to apply for the investing in skills? Basically, all employers that have an economic activity. So these could be limited liability companies, and individual self-employed, or business associations, partnerships, and as I mentioned before, NGOs and social partners. Again, the NGOs and social partners that do not conduct an economic activity can benefit from the scheme. So that's with regards to the employers, the entity that would be applying. Now, who are the eligible trainees? All that is required is that the trainee has a active employment with the active employment with the applicant employer, irrespective of if they're third country nationals, EU nationals, refugees. The status in the case of investing does not apply. We do not, however, support apprentices or students in vocational training, since they are employers, and both the students and the employers are already receiving a subsidy for their status as apprentices. And trainees that are seconded to a company and therefore not direct employees of the applicant company will not be eligible for funding. The applications need to be submitted just 7 days of calendar days before the training starts. We do encourage employers to send their applications a bit earlier. However, we can receive applications up to 7 days before the training starts. The application process is similar to the application process that Christian has just described. So all we are asking is that you fill in the forms and they can be sent via email on our dedicated generic email address of iis.jobsplus@gov.mt. What kind of training is eligible? Any classroom style training, that means training where there is direct contact with an employer, with a trainer, and this could happen in group sessions, one-to-one sessions, or on the job. E-learning that we classify as live sessions, which would be any training that is conducted over a platform such as Zoom, Skype, or similar. Basically, there is a live interaction going on similar to what we are doing now. And that kind of training is eligible subject to JobsPlus being given access to be able to conduct remote monitoring visits. In the case of classroom style, our monitoring officers used to go into the classroom, take photos, and make sure that the training being applied for is actually ongoing. In the case of e-learning, we do the same, however, we do it virtually. So we will just enter the session for a brief while, ensure that the training is ongoing, take a few screenshots and exit. We also accept training that is e-learning, however, through a pre-recorded session. This kind of training is considered to be self-led. However, we can only accept this kind of training, and the same as distance learning, if the training is recognized or accredited by the MFHEA, ITS, University of Malta, or MCAST. So what kind of training is not eligible? We accept basically all types of training. However, any training that is a legal requirement, such as, for example, food handling, cannot be supported under the scheme. I can give you other examples. For example, a driving license, forklift operator's course, health and safety training. Such training is a legal requirement. Hence, we cannot support it under the scheme. We do not support team building events or information sessions. And any training that is internal, that is where trainer and trainees are employed by the applicant entity organization, irrespective of their employment status. Another important thing is, I mentioned before, this is something quite new. So we have had some employees that have gotten very used to it. However, we really, again, must ask for the link in the cases of online training for our monitoring officers to be able to enter virtually into the session. So on our documents, part of the documents, in the case of online training, we ask you to put in the link in a special area in the form, so that you will find it ready to be able to enter. Again, in the case of online and distance learning, we still require attendance sheets. As I mentioned before, JobsPlus does not anymore ask for invoices, proof of payment. Part of the reimbursement documentation for any of the forms of training, be it classroom, online, or distance learning, require the trainer and trainees to keep an attendance sheet. So reimbursement stage, we have the attendance sheets. We ask employers, please, to keep periodical screenshots of the ongoing training. Although us as Jobs Plus, should it come in our sample, we do monitor the ongoing online training. We do not monitor the 100% anymore. So it is up to the employer to give us periodical screenshots of the ongoing training, as this actually forms part of the reimbursement documentation. I don't know if anyone has any questions. My contact details are here. Even if you think of something else to ask at a later stage, please feel free to drop me a call or send an email. And anyway, any questions?
Yes. So thank you for that, Martin. We have a question for sure. Rini is asking, does this scheme cover health and safety and skills training, which are required to apply for a skills card?
If it is health and safety and it is mandatory by law, no, it's not. If it's something that's over and above and it can be proven either through a risk assessment or actually that the employer has already given such kind of training and it's over and above the legal requirement, yes, it can.
Okay. Someone is asking us for the presentation. I know we have these already, so we will be circulating them following this webinar. Okay. Now, can you please explain again the €520 allowance? The €520 allowance.
Okay, so let's say you're going to apply now today, and the training program is 8 hours long, and the training is going to happen 4 hours on one day and 4 hours on another day. We will not only give a training subsidy of €25.85 per hour, but in addition, we top it up with an additional €5.20 per hour. That means for the total of the hypothetical 8 hours to cover the wage costs. Obviously, if the employer is already benefiting from COVID-19 and any benefits from COVID-19, we cannot give this 520.
Okay. Does the trainer need to be approved by Jobs Plus?
No. In fact, we leave it totally up to the employer to choose whichever training provider he needs. We don't go there. We leave it totally up to the employer. What we do, however, is we evaluate the training contents.
Okay. So with that, I think we have reached, we have asked all the questions that were to be asked. And I thank you very much, Martin. For those of you who are with us, if you have any more questions regarding any of the schemes we heard today, please take your time to think about them and to get back to us, and we will be liaising with Jobs Plus and with Malta Enterprise as necessary and getting back to you. You will be receiving the presentations following this meeting by email. And I thank you and I wish you a good afternoon.